thank you for risking everything to come here. And since it's just us, maybe we can make it more of a discussion too. If anybody wants to chime in more, ask questions, it doesn't have to be me lecturing, because really all I did was throw together some art I found just to prod my memory. I'm going back to one of the first things I think a lot of people who first heard of me was probably when I was doing X-Men First Class for Marvel. I actually had done work for comics in years before that, but mostly as an artist. And always jumping around here to there, never on a nice steady title where you could find me and decide if you liked me or not. And then I came out with a graphic novel called The Interman, which I got a lot of attention after that, and people started trusting me to write, and then Marvel invited me to start writing for them. One of my big problems I always had as an artist is deciding how to draw something. I always felt like art needed to adapt to the story. So I never really developed a super strong style that would stand out in anyone's head. But this way, I get to kind of be a billion different artists, because I'm always working with someone great. And I get to kind of jump in their mind, anticipate what they might want. And that's all I'm really wanting to talk about here is when I'm saying writing for drawing, I'm just trying to figure out how to work with your collaborator in a way that makes a very visual story something that should be a comic as opposed to prose or a poem or a puppet show. So anyway, Marko Drjevic was doing these covers for X-Men First Class, and most of them are things like the Lizard jumping out at the X-Men or the Vulture or whatever the threat of the week was hitting the X-Men. Well, I could tell he was already didn't care for that sort of stuff. And he made it abundantly clear when he quit Marvel and referred to it as, they all just want me to draw men in costumes crying. And I did this the one week. I said, can we do this story like a romance book where Angel and Scarlet Witch are just falling in love and maybe there's petals flying through the air? And that's about all I said. And this was one of my favorite covers that he did, because he clearly just wanted to do something very different. And he just lavished all that time on their hair. I don't know. I love stuff like that. But it's part of when I started realizing really acutely that sometimes artists are very direct, telling you what they want, and sometimes you got to drag it out of them. They'll say anything's okay, but they don't mean that, obviously. Fortunately, Mark Laming just left. I put up a few bits of his. He and I did King's Watch for Dynamite, and that brought back Flash Gordon, the Phantom, and Mandrake the Magician. And it ended up kind of being a foundation for them to run with miniseries of all the characters. I continued on. They sort of tricked me. I was originally agreed to do a Flash Gordon series. And then they said, well, King Features would like you to back it up and have these three characters, kind of like their big trinity. And I was like, well, okay, that's not what I planned to do. But then it turned out great, because I got to set up this whole war with Ming's Land Mongo, and got to have the amazing talent of Mark Laming on it. Often whenever you're starting a project, one of the very first things you've got to do is do the designs of the principals. And in this case, there wasn't a whole lot for me to just say. I just basically said to Mark, like, I don't think we need to reinvent these guys except to make some of their modern dress a little, current, but they need to look classic. It's like all the styles we have now can work with what they used to have. People can just deal with the fact that Mandrake wears a top hat and a cape. And look, he did it beautifully. Mark did such an excellent job, and this really helped revive the character of the Phantom, I think. We gave a grisly, kind of over-the-hill Phantom who's just jacked up on painkillers and full of scars and cartilage. And that's exactly the kind of grunting stuff Mark can do in his sleep. Everybody just looks great. But anyway, it was a pleasure to work with him. Who also cut out with him, Laura Margarita, who's an excellent artist if you don't know about. She'll be turning up a lot more. This was couple of pages she and I did of this special, if you know the Thrilling Adventure Hour, it's a live recorded like old pulp style but with modern jokes thing that Acker and Blacker, these two American comics, do. And we wrote this mini-series that for some reason never got further than the first issue, but it's a chance to work with a good artist. Kevin Nolan was a dream to work with. I had always wanted to just work with him in some capacity, and he agreed to do a little short in our X-Men First Class Annual. And at the time, I was still trying to figure out how to get artists to kind of tell me what they wanted to draw. Because sometimes you can say, like, what do you like to draw? And then they'll just say, like, oh, anything. Like, as long as it pays, or that sort of thing. And I didn't want to do that. And this time I asked a weird question of Kevin. Could you give me a list of things you like that could possibly end up in a story? And he actually did. He wrote out this long list of little artifacts and all kinds of little interesting oddball things. And I knew, like, again, Kevin's another one of those guys. He will draw straight superheroes and gets asked to do it all the time. But it's clearly not where his love lies. When he and Alan Moore did Jack Be Quick for the America's Best Comics, you could tell how he would lovingly draw a rusting old tractor or a cow. So I was like, so then I kind of looked through his list and went, okay. And the first page is me putting down something I would never ask ordinarily. It's just a Queen Anne style house, a Victorian house. And it's, you don't even really see the characters yet. You just see the signs at the bottom, that say beware the beast, and the living glacier called the Iceman. Like, it's the Museum of Oddities that goes along with that, because this place is supposed to be one of those little quirky museums that show you things like mermaid fish and stuff like that. And obviously he loved it. He also lettered and colored it because he can do everything. And I just described the guy as this older, gaunt man. Again, another kind of, he loves drawing goons. So, the way he draws the beast is just perfect with his giant hands, little forehead. And he loves to draw humor. So I just loaded it up with stuff like that. He gets to draw his esoterica, humor, slapstick. See, somebody gets hit in the head with an 8-ball. And the beast packs a whole chicken for lunch. It was all stuff that, like, he turned around really fast, even though supposedly he has a reputation for being slow. Kevin wrote back and said, hey, you really tuned all your stories to the artist. He's like, that was a great job in doing that. And I thought, okay, if he said I could do it, then I can. That really just encouraged me. So I really leaned into it. The whole point of this story was that Iceman and Beast were just sent out because the professor detected mutants, which is always a great short story thing to do with the X-Men anyway. Go find a mutant. And when they get here, the one they detected is this little gargoyle who turns out to not to actually be a stone gargoyle, but just a little man whose mutant gene is the fact that he looks like a gargoyle. And he kind of says, I can't do anything except look like a gargoyle. And so they just pretty much ends up making friends with the museum curator and the little guy, and they go kind of become partners of the museum. It's just a sweet little story. Nothing really heavy happening, and I think he appreciated that, because you can only take everyone, watching the Wayne parents die on the streets over and over. Obviously, then you get into a whole other territory when you're creating something original. Tom Fowler and I got to create Mysterious the Unfathomable at Wildstorm years ago. I had been doing a lot of likable characters up till then, and I wanted to do a really unlikable lead to see if I could make it work. Well, he's not it doesn't matter if he's likable, he just has to be interesting, obviously. And that's the kind of thing you need to think of when you're writing anyway. I think the main rule, if there's any rules of writing, is just don't bore the reader. do anything in the world, but as long as they're not bored, you're getting somewhere and you're making traction. So we came up with this. I had already pitched the idea, and then we approached Tom, who was it was perfect because he was actually trying out for another book that I was writing, but it wasn't something he would have co-owned. And the editor decided to not use him on that. And at the same time, Ben Abernathy and I said, oh, it looks like Tom's going to be free. Let's ask him. And literally within, as he says, within 45 seconds, he got an email saying he wasn't going to get this one job. And then the one saying, would you like to do Mysterious with Jeff? And I was like, wow, that's pretty good within a minute. And Tom immediately went crazy doing character designs. And we went back and forth on that for about a week and a half. So when we introduced Mysterious, that's the first shot you see of him. Because I feel like, especially in a medium like comics where you don't have hours to spare, you've got a couple of panels maybe to get a story up and running, show a character being themselves right at the very beginning. Right away you get the idea that Mysterious is kind of a creep. He's over there wooing some lady who is the assistant of this millionaire who has hired him to conduct a seance. And that was like a take of in Houdini's day. They would, rich people, because rich people are always looking for some crazy way to spend their money, and that hasn't changed apparently. And I like the idea that in the 2000s we were doing that again. And Mysterious actually gets everybody to hold hands, and he starts going into the land of the dead looking for this guy's mother who killed herself. And he's using the guy produced the gun that she used, and that's the mystic artifact that's kind of taking him to her. And Tom did this amazing thing. I said, well, we could just go nuts with this. There could be giant skeletons around, all this stuff, and then he draws this gigantic jawbone that he's stepping through, and weird little heads lying on the ground, telling him to pick him up. It's just beautiful stuff. And these all represent all the other people who are holding hands in the seance, these weird little flesh baggy things. Tom and I have still argued for years over exactly who should play Mysterious if we ever actually get a TV show or something going. But at the time, the one I was pushing for was like, let's just kind of base him sort of like on Jeffrey Rush. And, and Tom's take was, okay, let's have him just look like this absolute wreck of a man, but in this most expensive suit possible. And that's not something every artist can pull off, by the way. It does look really good. Part of the mechanics of our story was that you gain magical power by convincing people to essentially worship you like a god. And this one character figured out that he could write children's books and hide incantations in his clever rhymes, and that as parents were reading them to their children, they'd always be kind of working his spells and building out this whole little cast of demons in this world that they live in. So it's pretty much straight up Dr. Seuss rip that can't look exactly like Dr. Seuss. And I can't think of really too many people besides Tom who could have pulled that off. I can't remember the gorilla with the cape's name, but he was very important in the story at the time. And that was some old idea I had hanging around from another pitch. And I remembered it, and I was like, oh, wait, that would be even better here than wherever I was trying to do it to begin with, because now I'm working with Tom Fowler. That's one of the things I would just stress to you if you're working with another person, and this actually all works if you're the artist too. But you're not trying to browbeat an artist to become your more talented hand that can suddenly turn out beautiful illustrations. You're trying to use words to make electrodes that connect to their brain, and then you fire the button and pull a big lever, and their brain fires up with electricity and lights up, and they get just ideas rolling out and just cannot stop moving their hand to put down the things that are coming out of their head. That's the whole thing you're trying to do. You're also trying to do that to the editor. You generally have an audience of two at the very beginning, the editor and the artist. The editor has to be able to read what you wrote and see it all in their head, because if they can't see it, they're not going to let you proceed any further. That's just never going to happen. And if you are only creating it with maybe one or two other people and don't even have an editor, then you've really got to make it work for the artist. You don't want to, again, as I say, you don't want to try to browbeat them into drawing like some other artist you want. That's just the death of a book. You've got to embrace who they are. It's a more zen sort of way. And I've found that out the hard way. Right before I got on this is the Thunderbolts, by the way, by Marvel. That's Kev Walker. You know him. Before I got on that, the artist and I was just really kind of coming in after Andy Diggle and finishing off what he was doing after Warren Ellis. And essentially we're running out the clock to till we get to a new launch that was going to create a lot of new books. And I knew I was going to get to plan that and put together a whole new team. But I had to use a team that I didn't make before. And I was with an artist whose sensibilities were nothing like mine. It was really, really weird because just month after month I'd turn in something, and I don't know. I tend to work better, I think, with cartoonier people probably. And that guy was more into just using photo reference all the time. All my jokes fell flat dead on the page. I didn't feel like a lot of emotion got through, even though some people like those stories. But then the Lord delivered unto me Kev Walker. And this was just amazing. Kev came in. We had finally decided who all the team would be for the Thunderbolts. In a weird move, the editor said, "Hey, at the meeting, Joe Quesada was asking if anybody wanted to use Man-Thing, and I figured you would, so I called it." I'm like, okay. I wasn't thinking about that, but I was like, I like Man-Thing, and then I had to really think, what can Man-Thing can't do anything? He can't talk. You know, he just sort of administers sick burns on people's faces. And I was like, how's that going to come in? He doesn't listen to anybody. But then that's another one of those things where you're given a weird obstacle, and you turn it around try to turn it into a strength. I realized, oh yeah, they established Man-Thing as the kind of gatekeeper of the nexus of realities. Maybe I can make that so that he's the transporter of the team. And then once we go with that, and we had Ant-Man pop in and help rig that up. There's Man-Thing. With Luke Cage trying to figure out why Man-Thing is suddenly in his comic. And I love the way Kev initially drew him. He just made him this just mountain and put all these little butterflies always hanging around him, which was just something out of his head, nothing I called for. But I've noticed every artist since has kind of done the way Kev did it. He's always got little life crawling around and floating around him and everything. It's just beautiful. When we were initially emailing back and forth, Kev would never answer me. And I could tell, I was like, is he being hostile? What's he doing? But I could tell a lot of artists just initially do not trust a new writer they've never been put with before or didn't seek out on their own. And for good reason, because there's a lot of bums out there, and I don't blame them. And I think he was just waiting to see if I had any business actually writing a story. So for the longest time, he wouldn't write back, and it was really messing with me. I was like, he wasn't thinking about it at all, but I was thinking, what's he playing at? What's he trying to do? And then eventually, we just started then writing like little teens to each other all the time, tee and writing big long letters. Once he finally told me I did something okay. But I remember at the beginning, he wrote to me and said, "Look, he just kind of shambles about and doesn't say anything. We got to have him talk at some point." And I was like, all right, that's there. I'm going to use that. And anytime he said anything, I worked it into the story. But that ended up being a really long story that he finally got to conclude. Because I felt like if you do something really fast, these changes don't stick. At least not for superhero licensed comics like this. So we finally had Man-Thing speak his first words, which were, "What up?" And it makes sense in the context of the story. You find out Man-Thing speaks Excelsior, which is the universal language of everything. So everybody can understand him, and they all hear him the way they think he should sound. And for some reason, Boomerang thinks he says "what up" and calls him Booms and stuff like that. That's another thing you can do in any story. Remember, you don't have to do a global view of everything. You can show things through your most entertaining character's head. You could have done it any number of ways. It could have been a serious moment, but it's better as a funny moment, I thought. Because you get a few minutes of not knowing why Man-Thing talks that way until Satana, the half-naked witch lady, flies around and tells everybody what's going on. I just put this one in, too. This was one of the stories we did that everybody always comes up and talks about when I'm signing at shows. They had the character Hyperion. Isn't that gross? It was this character Hyperion gets forced on their team, and the Thunderbolts get sent to Japan to fight these giant monsters that are attacking. And you find out really quickly Hyperion is actually the evil Hyperion that they've established. And he immediately starts betraying and trying to kill off the rest of the Thunderbolts. And what the point of this story was to show the Thunderbolts finally coming together as a team. Because I just couldn't deal with them. I didn't want them always bickering and fighting amongst each other. You've seen that. You see it in the Justice League. You see it in the Avengers. It's just not that interesting to me. And I thought, well, you bring in somebody who's so horrible that all the rest hate him. And then they kind of just start to team up on him. And there is Man-Thing gets to end the issue by giving him a nice burn on the face after they've all curb stomped him. Kev even made his fingers all broken. He really thought maybe a little harder about that than I even expected. He can really do the gross stuff when he wants to. But that was the one everybody comes up to me. And it's funny because my editor was fighting this. He kept sending me back notes saying, can't they decide, though, that they have to really take him down because he's going to destroy the world? I went, what do they care about that? They're bad guys. It's like everyone will get that they hate him and they just want to beat him up. It's like we don't need anything more than that. And that's what everybody responded to. That was one of the few times I really just refused to back down on, because usually I think I don't own these characters. If the editor wants something changed bad enough, whatever. But I was like, no, I'm right about this. Everybody loved it. This is one of my favorite ones I did with Kev, was just a focus on Songbird. Sometimes one of the big things you got to factor in is artists need a break, especially when you're working on something like a team book. You can't just keep having all these panels with 7 characters, all over the place coming in. And luckily at this point, Marvel started trying to get us to do twice monthly comics, not bi-monthly, twice monthly. And I was like, okay, well, now I can do practically every lame idea I have. But no, I was like, I had a lot of ideas, and I just always assume I've got to cut them down. I can't use a lot of things that I wanted to do, but I really got to do almost everything I wanted to do because of this crazy increased schedule. And we decided to do one story focused on her. And this was another thing. Kev always just he relished the fact that it made fanboys mad that we buzzed her hair originally. She had a real spiky punk haircut. And then gradually over the stories, it had grown out again. And I think that was Declan growing it out because he was listening to the fans, which you should never do. And then we got her in this story, and she gets attacked by Dr. Orcus, this crazy oceanographer, mad scientist. And they buzz her head to operate on her brain. So she ends up getting a even more punk haircut by the end of it, which was, again, Kev flipping off the fans. But, I loved it. And he and I got to create Troll, which was a character I really liked. And I've seen some people do cosplay of her. She's perfect to cosplay, though, because you can draw this, put this great big animal head on her. At that same time, like I said, Declan Shalvey had been working on, I think, some zombie comic for Boone or something. Yeah. And I was talking to him at a convention, and I knew that they were going to start pressuring me for more stories. And I didn't want it to turn into one of those things where you have a zillion rotating artists. I thought, just one other artist would be good. And then we can do arcs, and the two don't interrupt each other, and they don't have to read each other's stories, and they don't have to fight about how things go. We'll just keep them separate. And I even created 2 separate Thunderbolts teams. I was like, okay, we'll impress the editor. I'm going to write something that will look really hard, but will be easy for Declan to draw, because Declan did lots of silhouettes, and he's a master of using just heavy blacks. And I said, well, I'll write all these ninjas attacking. And then after we'd already approved everything and he had started laying it all out, they said, no, they've got to be hand ninjas who all wear these red costumes so they're not actually in all black. Because I was expecting Declan to just kind of rough it all out and then go in and draw it with ink, which would have the kind of thing he can do easily. And so it ended up being the hardest job for him, and I felt so bad. But it really won him over there. They were all impressed with it. He did the standalone Man-Thing story where I got to take it a little easier on him because Man-Thing, again, butterflies, swamp, stuff like that. Declan also I enjoyed because I realized really quickly he was up to a weird challenge like stuff like this. This was from Fear Itself, but the challenge is, like you getting something like that, it's like, how can I pull the good story out of the crossover? You know, I always look to the example of Walt Simonson, who, when given the whole Secret Wars crossover in the 80s, he came up with Curse, this big cool character, and made it work, and it's something they still use to this day. But we did this one story, Juggernaut is possessed by the force that's possessing everybody, and they decide to go inside his mind. And I said, what if we try to make it more like an abstract painting? And instead of drawing them as characters floating around, what if they just had little avatars that represented them? Which is why you get little things like this. He did this nice, great big layout of this. And it's such a strange thing to pull off. At the time, I think Frank Martin was still coloring. He hadn't successfully got it to where Jordi Belair was coloring everything he did. But that's no problem because Frank Martin's one of the best colorists in the business and he can adapt to anybody. So they're flying around like little Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you only see this kind of weird representation of Ghost as they go through his mind and this winding snake thing. And it's funny because I wrote it knowing it was going to be bizarre, and Deck made it even more bizarre than I had imagined. And I wanted to kind of get to that sort of Steve Ditko sort of thing like Doctor Strange would always have. You know, it's always weird mouths opening in the sky, giant eyes, all that sort of thing. Because I felt like Marvel had gotten away from that and they needed to get back to it. Anyway, we had a great time working on that. And then Declan, who I just had to like argue with him over to let him write, you know, he can do anything he wants there. Same thing happened with Chris Samnee. I had a hard time getting Chris Samnee on Agents of Atlas thing I was working on. And now, obviously, you know, Marvel will do anything to keep him that they can. So that's good. Read everything Declan does. Speaking of Agents of Atlas, this is some black and white art by Gabriel Hardman. It was Mr. Lowe, the dragon, talking to Jimmy Woo. That series kept coming back in so many forms, mainly because my editor really liked it and key people at Marvel liked it. They never promoted it, ever. And people would say, well, you had them fight the Avengers and stuff. It's like, yeah, but we weren't in the Avengers. The Avengers were in our comic. That's the difference. And the way those typically work is Marvel and DC, they usually approve something for about 5 or 6 issues. And they're just always looking through their budget, seeing what they've got. And they'll take a chance on a few new things. And if it's making a certain amount of money or the initial sales aren't dropping too far, then they'll okay you to do 5 or 6 more. So you get 2 trades. And if it is, they just simply stop doing it. And people always refer to it as the book's canceled. It's never really canceled. It's just not approved to continue going on. But gosh, I love the way Gabe draws dragons. He and I had a great time working together. He storyboards a lot of stuff for Christopher Nolan, like all those Dark Knight movies, Interstellar, Inception. This was one of the Atlas, and it was the original Avengers thing, and everybody's just beating on the Hulk. I like the way Jimmy Woo's firing guns at him like that does any good, but still everybody's doing something. Everybody's helping. Giant Man's about to hit. Clearly a shield has already hit him. By the way, this is one of those when you're working for somebody like Marvel or DC, occasionally throw the artist a bone and give them something they can sell. A nice big pin-up splash page with all the characters. I thought, that'll pay Gabe's mortgage for the month. Here's a couple more pages. I love this story. It was the last Atlas series that we did, and it was the one introducing him, the 3D man. And he's kind of washed up. He killed the Skrull everybody liked, and I realized, when I went and read what Dan Slott and Christos Gage had done with that, I was like, actually, we can bring him in, because the whole thing about Atlas is they're the second chance team. They come back for each other. They pull each other out of oblivion. And Gabe liked the whole thing. We were setting it in Los Angeles, not far from where he lives at Griffith Park there. It's got a gorilla in it. It's got everything. You really should read it sometime. Jumping back to Dynamite, Evan Shaner and I were put together to work on the Flash Gordon comic, which was the whole thing I had wanted to work on the first place. They gave me a whole list at the beginning saying, "Are any of these look interesting?" And I was like, Flash Gordon. Because I had an idea about Flash Gordon that I'd always kind of wanted to do. I really admired like Alex Raymond, the creator, and Al Williamson, the artist who worked on Flash Gordon a lot before being known as the Star Wars guy forever. My take was simply that Flash was good at everything that didn't matter on Earth, because he's this kind of rich, fresh out of college guy, adventure, thrill seeker. He actually does still play polo because he went to an old Ivy League school and they played polo. He can sword fight, he scuba dives, he climbs mountains, he bungee jumps off cliffs. And it's all stuff that his father hates because he wants him to run his business, but Flash has no head for business. But suddenly when dropped on the planet Mongo, he's amazing because he can ride lizards and fight gorilla men as much as you can stand. By the way, I just wanted to jump back. I mentioned Jordi Belair before. She colors probably most of the comics you've read. This is one of those where I kind of thought about it and I said, what if we do a spread and we did the title like a big movie thing but in the sky and just show some nice clouds and stuff like that. And that really, again, was me trying to take it easy on Evan. But you can't just say that with any colorist. Like, it has to be somebody like Jordi who could make this sky that looks real and gorgeous. It's like, I've seen people try to pull off a gorgeous sky in comics a lot, and it doesn't usually work. But that was no problem because she is a master of color art. Now this is just going to sound like I only write for shortcuts, but I while I was on that train of thought, we did a Convergent Shazam couple of specials. So the whole thing with that was Dan DiDio asking me, I got a list of all these things to do for Convergence, and I was like, is the Marvel family in there? He goes, just let me read the list. And he's going through it, and then when he finally gets to it, I went, okay, that's it, I call that. And then they were doing like a Battle World sort of scenario. So you take an older version of Captain Marvel, not the version they're doing, but the good version. That's what we got to do. And then have them fight somebody. And they threw up some other ones, and all I could think on that time was try to think on Evan's behalf. Gotham by Gaslight, while it didn't make any sense for a fight, I knew it would make good visuals. That, by the way, is where I start with most of my comic stuff. I know when you read like James McKee talking about screenplays or any writer who talks about writing, they try to talk about putting a character through the loops and sort of like what's something that really tests who a character is. And I really don't think about that at that stage. The first thing I think about is what's going to make this interesting to look at, because I feel like the visuals are so much a part of what make a comic book work. You know, I don't want to have, say, Superman appear and then he just walks across the country. I think that would be a bad visual. But flying through a fire land, that's suddenly interesting. So I try to think in terms of that. And in this one, of course, you know, I had the great cast of Captain Marvel to work with. But the predicament of the story was they were all without their powers at the beginning of the story, which was kind of nice because, you know, it turns out Evan Shaner is amazing at drawing kids. And Billy Batson, spending more time as Billy Batson, actually made Captain Marvel count a lot more when he shows up. But then at this point, I was thinking I need to come up with something, again, a double-page spread that could be drawn really fast. And it hit me that I could have the Gotham by Gaslight Batman hit Captain Marvel with a big electric charge, which would often like switch his transformation. After a little more stewing on it, I realized, well, what if like in this split thousandth of a second, Captain Marvel and Billy can interact, you know, because the actual original way they wasn't Billy was growing up to be Captain Marvel. They were two separate characters. So we have that, and I just thought, yeah, let's just have a big bolt of lightning, and you only get to see partial heads of Billy and Cap, and they're having their discussion. And it's one of the coolest scenes of the book. It's like the whole thing's designed to be easy to do, but it ended up putting us in a place doing something we never done before, and something I'd never seen in the Captain Marvel story, where they decide, and then Billy's able to actually control the transformation and lets Captain Marvel turn back just in time before he hits the ground. Adapting to some difficulty or some kind of fork in the road often will get you to a more interesting story place than if you were just cleanly following your plot right down to the end. Yes, we must have some adversity. No, have some real adversity thrown at you and then try to write around it. And then you actually come up with something. That reminds me of this book, Bucko, that I did with Erica Moen, who before this she did a autobio comic called Dar. And she was a little burned out on that and people knowing too much about her life. And she wanted to do something, and she told somebody on a podcast she wanted to work with me, which was weird because she and I work in the same office, and literally she could have walked over and told me she wanted to work with me. So I started daydreaming about what could be the kind of story where she and I would intersect well. And we both live in Portland, Oregon, which is obviously this hipster mecca. And I kind of took it as a challenge to start working in something that happened almost every day, just in real life while I was out riding my bike or when I was on the light rail. Just any weirdo, any wino or crack addict who wandered in babbling something, I'd go, And I started really writing, because this was one of those cases I could do something like that. And then I really, just to really mess with Erica, who didn't want to do autobio comics anymore, I kept working in details of her life into the story. Every time she's like, "This is me," like, yeah, and I just kept doing that because it just gave it some kind of special energy I don't think I could have gotten ordinarily. Like Bucko is actually a nickname she calls her brother, and she said it on the phone one day while I was planning stuff, and I went, "That's a good name." Yeah, in fact, that phone call I remember. She was picking it up, and she saw the name Eric, and she goes, "Hey, what's up, Bucko?" And it wasn't her brother, it was another Eric that she was actually calling her about work. She's talking really casually with him, which is throwing this guy off, and he's super uncomfortable, and you could even tell from the other side of the phone. And then she suddenly, "Oh, I'm sorry." Also, Erica changed the whole dynamic of the story just because she almost refused to draw a guy. Like, she would still, like, make the guys poke hips around and everything like she would draw herself doing in her webcomic. And I finally went, "Screw it, you're not going to draw Bucko. I'm writing him out of the story." And he actually vanishes from most of the story, and I make it about this whole gang of women from that point on going to solve the murder mystery in the story. And it's great because you don't see it coming, and then I was shocked to find it all actually tied up in a neat ball at the end of it. And I was generally also doing stuff like when you're doing some real indie thing, I was like, I'm going to do all the things I can't do in these superhero comics. You know, I can't have all this sex talk and weird ass jokes and things like that. It's not appropriate for Batman 66 or whoever, you know, but it'll go in here just great. I'm proud of it. Let's see. Okay, back to Evan. We've been doing Future Quest this past year. This has gone over pretty well. It's, you know, we were all tasked to launch the Hanna-Barbera characters back with DC, who has owned them forever and is not really doing anything with them at that point. And originally, the plan of this, the late great Darwin Cook helped me plot a lot of this initial story. I think what happened is they asked him to do it, and then he had just read the Flash Gordon stuff, so he said, "Well, I would just bring in Parker and Shaner," which was, you know, so nice of him. And obviously, I didn't know at the time, and practically no one outside of his very tight circle knew that he had been diagnosed with cancer, and so he probably wasn't going to take on anything big. He did the Twilight Children with Gilbert Hernandez, which is an amazing Vertigo book to seek out. But he and I got together at a show, and we talked out a lot of this and figured out how the cast could come back, and kind of did it much the way Evan and I did Flash Gordon, where everybody still looks mostly like their classic selves. We just tried to flesh out the story a little more, give Space Ghost a big tragic backstory that kind of ties into the thing that's going to attack Earth and why he's the only one of his kind left at the end of the beginning. Why he is a Space Ghost and why Jen and Jay seem to have uniforms. Why there's a monkey, I don't know, but there's just got to be a monkey somewhere in the story. Unfortunately, Evan couldn't draw like the whole series. He keeps coming in bits and flashes. And then at some point I said, how about save him for the last 2 issues so we have a nice strong ending? Because the other big rule of telling stories is the audience will forgive you anything if you really crush it with the ending. If you just have a mediocre ending, it all kind of fades from memory and people remember. But if you come back with a nice strong ending, you can get away with a lot, I think. And I just grabbed a few pages here of this is Travel Foreman. He and I did a little short-lived run on Justice League United. And I was thinking about him as far as one of those artists I can't anticipate what he's going to do, because Travel's like a real free thinker. I kept trying to do a style thing where I would start every issue with a splash page, and he immediately wrecked that plan by just breaking it all up and having all this stuff going on. And I had to write back and like, Travel, what are they doing? He's like, I just thought they might do this. I like drawing little panels. I'm like, oh, okay. So I would have to then go back and kind of figure out, what are people saying? I've had a number of artists do that to me, by the way. But it's worth it, because look how gorgeous it is. He would do all this cool stuff. This was the House of Secrets issue where they meet Abel and go into the House of Secrets. He drew that more gory than I imagined at the time. But it doesn't matter, because Mr. Abel's thing is he always gets killed and comes back anyway. Anyway, the House of Secrets was emitting this energy and destroying part of the planet, and they had to get in there and stop it. Here's a black and white page. Here's what he would give us to color from. He would do all this gray tone work under everything. Look at his Etrigan. That's the best demon. And then he would fade things out completely, which kind of caught me off guard. But we had a good colorist who knew how to work with it. I like his Mara there, too. I was also writing Aquaman at the time, so it was cool to have her in there. The main thing I wanted to come away with when I'm talking about stuff exploding out in the ocean, none of this is the way I imagined it. And it's always really interesting to see how another artist doesn't think like you at all, and yet you're still going to put together something that's going to work for the reader. Yeah, and years ago I might have sent back some like sketches, like can it be more like this? But now I'm much more easier. It's like, if it works, it works. Just because I didn't see it that way doesn't mean it's not right. I only really go crying to the artist if they change something that makes the story a different story, and really gets it off whatever the theme was. And themes, I don't try to force them. I don't go in saying this is about redemption or anything like that. I just let the theme kind of surface over the course of the story. And then if I've got time before someone starts drawing, I'll run back and play it up a little bit, because I think generally that should sort of be a psychological thing that you don't necessarily know you're doing at the beginning. I don't think you have to know everything a story is doing for it to be good, and you probably shouldn't.